Good day everyone, welcome to the second part of the methodology video lecture, and in this lecture we will talk about instrumentation and research rigor in quantitative research in the social sciences. So what are we going to be talking about in this lecture? So we'll talk about the typology of variables, outside, independent, dependent, moderating, mediating variables, and then we'll talk about the research instrument, which is another very important part of designing and planning your research methodology. And also we're going to be talking about rigor. Rigor meaning the quality and the truthfulness of a quantitative research based on its methodologic design. We'll talk about reliability and validity in quantitative studies. So in the previous lecture, we learned about the typology of variables based on their relationship with each other. So if the variable in question is the presumed cause of the relationship, then we call them independent variables. And if this is the presumed effect, then that is the dependent variable. But there are other ways that we can measure or categorize our variable, and this is based on their nature in terms of how they are measured in the study. So the first type of variable in terms of its nature is continuous variables. So what are continuous variables? So continuous variables are numeric variables that have an infinite number of values between any two values. And they are measurable, numeric, and also they can come with decimal points. No? So an example of continuous variables may be height or blood pressure, etc. Okay? And then we also have discrete variables. Discrete variables are countable variables. Now, the values in between the two values are not infinite. No? So an example of discrete variables would be number of students in a class or number of people in the house. So if it's countable, it's discrete. If it's measurable, then it's continuous variables. Next, we also have categorical variables. So categorical variables contain a finite number of categories or distinct groups, and it may have a logical or non-logical order. So examples of categorical variables would be civil status, because the categories that are available for that type of variable is finite. We have single, married, separated, or widowed. And then also, so that one does not have a logical order. But we also have categorical variables that have a logical order. For example, educational attainment, like we have elementary graduate, junior high school graduate, senior high school graduate, college graduate, etc., etc., and no schooling. So we do know that there is a logical order for this, with elementary undergraduates or elementary graduates of lower educational attainment compared to the college graduates. And we also have a specific categorical variable, which we call dichotomous variable. And dichotomous variables are those variables which only has two categories. So for example, in this case, we have male or female, we have yes or no. So for male and female, what's the name of our variable? It is gender. So this is an example of dichotomous variables. Another form of dichotomous variables is in relation to experimental designs. Like for example, the independent variable is that there is exposure to the experimental condition and non-exposure to experimental condition. So there are two options. So that is also called a dichotomous variable. Next, another categorization for variables in a more statistical way is what we call scales of measurement. So it looks into the statistical nature of the variables as they are being measured in the study. There are 4 scales of measurement that needs to be remembered by you, especially when you go to your statistics course and when you go to your more advanced quantitative research course in the next terms, because this is the basis for the higher level statistics like inferential statistics in the future. And these are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So all of these variables are labeled because you need some form of label for your variable, like gender or level of satisfaction or physical literacy. So there is a name for the variable. So that's the first thing that's important. In order for you to call it a variable, there has to be a name for the variable. So this is something that's common to them. So for nominal variables are categorical variables that do not have a meaningful order. Okay, so they don't have meaningful order. So what could be an example of a nominal variable? An example of a nominal variable would be civil status. Kasi you have single, married, separated, and then widow. But there's really no order there. Married doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or it's higher than single, or separated is higher than widow. No, so there isn't really there's really no meaningful order for this. Or for example, another example of a nominal would be gender, because you have male and female, but it doesn't mean that male is higher than female or female is higher than male. So there's no meaningful order for these categories, categorical variables. So again, nominal variables nominal measure or nominal scales are categorical variables that does not have meaningful order. So next we have ordinal scales. So what are ordinal scales? Ordinal scales are variables that have meaningful order, as you see in this chart, but they don't have a measurable difference in between the values. So in short, ordinal variables are also categorical variables. So there is no measurable distance in between the two variables. So an example of an ordinal variable is educational attainment. Right? So, for instance, we know that for educational attainment, we know that elementary graduate is lower compared to a college graduate, But we are not sure about the distance in between each type of category because it's not numerical. So, because it's not numerical, we cannot really understand we cannot really measure the difference in between these categories. So, what is the difference between nominal and ordinal data? Or before that, what is the commonality between nominal and ordinal data? Nominal and ordinal data can be construed as categorical data. But the difference between nominal and ordinal is that ordinal data has a meaningful order compared to nominal data or nominal scale that does not have a meaningful order. Next, we have interval scales. So what are interval scales? Interval scales have a meaningful order and also they have a measurable difference, but they don't have a true zero starting point. So this is something that might be confusing to understand. So we will go now to also the last so that we can compare. So the last one and the more powerful one, we have the ratio scale. So the ratio scale, it has meaningful order. You can measure the difference in between the values and also there's a true zero starting point. So an example, for instance, of a ratio scale would be salaries in pesos. Okay, so we do know that the value, let's say you have 1,000 per day. That's quite high, So you are earning 1,000 per day, and then person number 2 is earning 500 per day. So we are sure that the difference between 1,000 and 500 is countable. We know that there is a 500 worth of difference between 1,000 and 500. Why? Because these are numerical and countable variables. We do know that someone who is 6'2" and 5'2" has 12 inches of difference between them. Unlike, for instance, ordinal, wherein when you say someone is elementary undergraduate or elementary graduate and you have someone who's college undergraduate, you cannot really count the difference in the between the two values. But for interval and ratio, you can differentiate. You can compute for the difference because in the first place, the variables are countable. So they're either, for interval and ratio, they're either discrete or they're either also continuous variables. Now, what is the difference between interval ratio and what do we mean by a true zero starting point? There are variables or there are measures that when you say the level is zero, it doesn't necessarily mean that a phenomenon is gone. So for example of an interval scale is temperature. When we say that the temperature is 0 degrees Celsius, it doesn't mean that there is no temperature. It just means that it's very, very cold. So 0 here means that, 0 here means that it's really just cold because we have a negative 1 degree Celsius, we have negative 10 degrees Celsius. If you go to Antarctica, you can go to even negative 50 degrees Celsius. So there's no zero starting point. Unlike when you look at salaries in pesos, for example, in ratio, when you say that your salary is 0 pesos, it means that you have no salary. You start with 0. Okay? And also, what do you call this? When you there's no negative 1. Your salary is never negative 1, negative 5. No, there's no negative salary. No, so you are really beginning your variable with 0. All right. So when do we usually see interval scales in social science research, or in sports studies research? Usually we see interval scales when we make use of scales which have 1 as the lowest score and let's say 50 as the highest score. So that's an example of interval scale. Or for example, an IQ test is an example of an interval scale because there's really no 0 IQ. So that's an example of an interval scale. And for ratio scale, for example, we have heart rate. So when we say that the 0, when your heart rate is 0, it means that your heart is not beating. So you start, there's no negative to that, and also when your heart rate is 0, your heart rate is gone. All right. And also when you say that another would be blood pressure, so that's another example of a ratio scale, or for example when you talk about speed, the number of seconds for you to reach 100 meters, right? So it is also a ratio scale because you start with 0 in that measurement. You don't start with negative 5 seconds in measuring speed, in taking a 100-meter sprint. Now also remember that the way we ask our variable in the questionnaire can transform the variable from one scale to another. So for example, when we ask salaries in pesos and we ask the respondent to answer the actual salary, like for example 10,500 or 2,500, then that is a ratio scale. But when we ask our participant to measure, what's your check which applies to you. So do you have 0 to 1,000? 1,001 to 10,000. Okay, so for this one, it becomes ordinal. Why? Because again, what happens is that the difference between the two values are not anymore determinate because you've already put them in brackets. But usually, when we measure salary, so that it will be easier to answer, we use ordinal. We use brackets. Like for example, class A, class B, class C, class D, usually based from the National Economic Development Authority. They have a bracket for class A, class B, class C, class D persons. Because it's easier to estimate yourself within a bracket rather than actually saying your actual salary, because sometimes it's hard to remember and some salaries are not the same every month, especially when you're doing overtime work. However, how do I choose the best scale of measurement for the variables that I am measuring? So it's really important to look at two things. So the first one, you take the scale of measure, if possible, the most robust. The most robust possible, that's where you go for. So the most robust scale of measurements for good statistical testing are usually interval and ratio, but it is not applicable for all types of variables. You cannot push gender to be a ratios because it's always a categorical variable. It's always a nominal variable because there's no meaningful order for them. You know, and the second one is what is more feasible and easier to answer. No, for example, when you ask people to report their age, is it easier for them to check their age in a bracket, like for example, for 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, or would it be easier or better for them to answer it with their actual age? So that would be feasibility. But usually when we measure age, we measure them as how old are you in years, and then they write their actual age. And that maintains its being a ratio scale because when you put it in actual bracket, it becomes ordinal. And again, it loses its robustness and there is a lesser option. There are lesser options for you in terms of applying statistics later. No, if you transform it that way, no? But in terms of salaries, my suggestion is to make it ordinal because usually, and we've tried this before in our previous research, we ask them to write their actual value for the salaries. Usually they leave an empty blank. They don't fill out the blank because usually one, they are quite ashamed of telling their actual salary, or two, it's hard for them to remember to estimate. So it's better for them to answer it using a more ordinal way. Okay, so, and you will learn more about these decisions when you go to your more advanced quantitative research class, probably next term. So why did we have to learn about the nature of the variables? Because the nature of the variables will dictate the way we should measure those variables. And the tool that we use in order to measure the variable is the research instrument. So we call research instruments. So research instruments are measurement tools. For example, in social science research, we use questionnaires or scales like this in the right. And it's designed to obtain data on a topic of interest from research subjects. And the topic of interest is your variables. And then we have to make sure that the instrument that we are using is in a way validated. So what you mean when you say validated? It is validation is the process that instruments go through to ensure that it is accurately and reliably collecting the data it needs to collect. Accurately means validity. When you say validity, how correct is the data that we are measuring? No? What would be the best way of measuring it? And reliability talks about the consistency. We are measuring the same variable consistently across all of the respondents. No, and when you talk about social variables, like for example mental well-being, or when you talk about physical literacy, or when you say attitudes towards sports, no, these are quite latent or hard to measure abstract variables, and you need to transform these variables into measurable components. Now, especially when you're not an expert, it's going to be difficult to actually create a questionnaire on your own. So you need some form of validation in order to make sure that the questionnaires or the survey forms that you are creating really are measuring the variables that you are intending to measure. And this is something that you and your advisor and your mentor and your panel members will be checking, when you are proposing. Now, there are different types of validation. The first type, we have the face validation. So when we say face validation, it's really more of checking the language of the questionnaire, the layout of the questionnaire. Is it readable? Is the language understandable based on the respondents? Like for example, if your respondents are children, is your language understandable for children? If it's for people from the province, is it using the language that is understandable for people in the province? No, should this be in Filipino? Should this be in English? So this is one of the things that we look at. So if it's in Filipino, it has to be seen by a Filipino expert. If it's seen in English, then it has to also be seen by an English expert. And also we look at the layout, what would be the best layout of the research, so that people will be able to read it legibly, and also to be able to make sure that the participants or the respondents get to answer all the questions and they don't miss it so much. Because when they miss answering all of the questions, usually the questionnaires or that response is deleted. That's already attrition for you. Another form of validation, we have expert validation. So expert validation has, of course, two. The first one is content, is the face, and the second one is content validation. So, for example, you are studying about motivation, so you might want to present your questionnaire to a psychologist who is an expert on motivation, so that they would see the items in your questionnaire and they would say whether or not the questions you are asking are relevant to the variable that you need to measure. Now, face and content expert validation is just like the first level of validation for questionnaire. The best way to really validate the questionnaire is to do statistical validation. And there are many ways that you do this. You have construct validity. So when you say construct validity or construct validation, this is a statistical way of really making sure that the variables or the indicators that you are putting in your questionnaire really measure the variable that you intend to measure. And there are many complicated statistical tools that are needed. Luckily, you can already get a questionnaire that has undergone this type of validation. And then you also have discriminant validity, means that this variable is measuring the variable that you intend to measure, and also is related to other phenomena that are related to it, or it is not related to other phenomena that are not related to it. So again, this is another way of looking at the validity or the correctness or the accuracy and the precision of your questionnaire. And then, of course, we have reliability. Reliability means that there is consistency in the way that they are measured. For example, if I am taking this questionnaire today and it's about my motivation or it's about my personality, if I answer it 5 days from now, will I get the same result? If not, then maybe there's an issue on the consistency of the questionnaire. Another way of looking at consistency is also seeing whether or not the items are really related to each other and helping each other in order to really come up and measure the overall variable, and that's called internal consistency, and we use Cronbach alpha in order to measure that. You will learn that in your higher level statistics courses, but for the meantime, I'm just introducing you to these concepts so that you have an idea of how do we make sure that the instrument is really measuring the variables that you intend to measure. And I have explained this earlier over and over again, that each variable has to have its own instrument. So if you go back to your conceptual paradigm and you see that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables there should be 5 parts in your questionnaire, because each variable has to have its own instrument to measure. And then, of course, each component of the variable, like for example, social demographic profile, you have age, gender, civil status, they also have to have their own indicators in the said instrument. Remember that if you leave one variable or one component, that could mean a revision for you, and that could be problematic for your grade in the future. So make sure that all of your variables will have their own instruments and will have their own space in the overall questionnaires that you'll be constructing for your study. And I also told you this in our previous lecture, that your instrument must be aligned with your conceptual framework, right? So if your instrument says that mental toughness has component number 1, component number 2, component number 3, your definition of terms should also have an operational definition of mental toughness has component number 1, component number 2, component number 3, and finally your instrument should also have indicators that measure these components. Remember that your conceptual framework, your hypothesis, your statement of the problem, your definition of terms, and your instruments must be consistent with each other if you want to have a good paper and you want to make a good proposal. Now we are talking about survey forms, no? Surveys or questionnaires as forms of data collection instruments, no? As instruments for data collection, and that is because that's the most common that we use in social science research, surveys, no? Because we usually do cross-sectional studies in social science research. But there are other forms of instruments based on other forms of data collection. For example, if your data collection is not a survey or you're using an interview or focus group discussion, your instrument are guide questions, no? Your interview questions. Again, this is the tool that you use in order for you to elicit interview answers from your informants. And then when your data collection is an observation, then you can either have observation checklists, like for example, you're observing behavior of people. Then you can use that checklist if that person is exhibiting that behavior, or you can also do field notes. It's a narrative explanation of what you are currently observing. In the sports sciences, there are other things that you observe, like for example, the speed. So we may need to use a stopwatch to see the speed of a person, or for example, you might need a tape measure to be able to measure the flexibility of the person. So these are also instruments that we make use, no? And also probably the data, the recording sheet that you need in order to measure speed or in order to measure flexibility is also an example of observation checklist, observation instrument. So again, your instrument will vary based on the data collection method that you are using, no? But again, our discussion here will be more on surveys, because in a quantitative research in the social sciences, survey is usually one of the go-to data collection methods that we use. So we'll focus our discussion more on creating questionnaires. Now, before that, let us discuss about the different typologies of surveys. Now, there's what we call a researcher-administered survey and a self-administered survey. When we say a researcher-administered survey, it is the researcher who's holding the instrument or the survey form, and the researcher or the assistant of the researcher or an enumerator is interviewing the person, and while the person is answering the questions, it is the researcher who is filling out the survey form. So, for example, in this picture, no, like for example, censuses. This is a researcher administered or enumerator administered survey. It is not the research. It's not the participant or respondent who is answering the question on their own. But if it is the the participant or it is the respondent who is answering the questionnaire on their own, for example, you give them the paper, you give them instructions, and then you leave them for 5 minutes, and then you return and you get the questionnaire from them. That's called self-administered. So, there. So, what are the pros and cons? So, researcher-administered, usually the biggest con here is that it takes more time to administer. But the pro here is that you are sure that, the person is understanding the question, and they have a way to ask you if they don't understand the question. For self-administered, the pro of this is that you can just give it to people, leave it with them for 5 to 10 minutes, or you leave it with them overnight and then you collect them tomorrow. It takes less time for you to get more responses, Or if this is online, you just put it online and then they click the link of your online survey and then they answer it on your own. The con here is that you won't be there to be able to answer their questions, just in case they have a question on the questions that you are posting in your questionnaire. But in order for you to get over that, because usually what we use is a self-administered survey so that it won't be so taxing on the researcher, is to make sure that your questionnaire has to have complete instructions that are easily understandable, and you should always have there your contact details so that they can call you if they don't understand. But really, the language has to be very, very acceptable, appropriate for whoever your audience or respondent is, so that they readily understand the questions, even if it's only them who is answering it. So most of the time we do self-administered because that's easier and that takes little time to get more people in a survey research. Next, in terms of the form of the survey, so we can do pen and paper survey. And this is really good, especially pre-COVID times, because you print out the questionnaire and then you give it to them personally. You give it out, for example, to a class, and then you give instructions orally, and then you allow them to answer it for 10 to 15 minutes, and then they return the questionnaire to you. The pro for this is that you are there. You can be there to be able to answer that question while they are answering it. And the con of this is, one, environmental waste, because you have to print a lot of papers. Number two, there is unlike an online survey wherein you are going to force a person to answer all of the questions before they move, there is a chance of getting attrition because they don't get to complete it because probably they missed answering one item. We also have a telephone survey that is a type of a researcher-administered survey wherein a person calls the number of a person from a directory and then asks questions there. And the pro of this is just like the pro for your researcher-administered, except that you don't have to go to the person personally in order to collect the data. The con here is that nobody is answering their phones. In this time, in this moment in time, we rarely see people answering unregistered caller IDs. If you do not know the person who's calling you, you rarely, so there's a chance that there would be higher attrition for telephone surveys. And also another con is that it will take so much time and it will take a lot of load, because good luck if you'll be able to really access people with landlines, because most of our communications lines are more mobile, and therefore it can cost more for the researcher. And then, of course, the most common one that we use, especially during the COVID period, is an online survey. We usually use SurveyMonkey, or personally I use Google Forms, and this is the most convenient one and the more environmentally friendly one, in doing surveys, because one, you just, you can have access to online, and you can already have, unlike pen and paper survey that you have to collate the responses and put them in your computer and encode them in your computer, online surveys automatically give you an Excel file or a spreadsheet automatically. You don't have to key in one by one. When I was a younger researcher, I had to do that, key in every number one by one, every row, and that's going to have human error with it. But for online survey, when the participant, gets to answer, automatically it gets recorded in an Excel file. So it's online surveys are easier nowadays. The only issue with online surveys, the verifiability is going to answer, right? Unlike pen and paper survey, you know exactly that the person who's answering your question is your target population, because you can see the person right in front of you while you're giving the survey. But for online surveys, you're not sure who's accessing the link. I'm pretty sure that, not many people are wasting their time strolling over surveys, answering surveys, even if they don't fit the inclusion criteria. I think that's going to be a very rare occurrence, but it doesn't mean that occurrence cannot be there. So there should be an effort for the researcher to be able to bypass that issue by really targeting where you paste the link. You just don't paste the link on Twitter and just hope that everybody's who sees it would know that they are part of the inclusion criteria. So usually, previously, the students would go to actual Facebook groups, no, or online communities where their target respondents are, so that it's not going to be an issue on inclusion criteria. Another way of getting over that bypass is or bypassing that issue is already also ask in the questionnaire your inclusion criteria. Like, for example, if your inclusion criteria is a gamer, then you can ask in the questionnaire, do you consider yourself a gamer? And then when they say yes, then they continue with answering the question. If they say no, then you end already the survey and you don't collect data from them anymore because they are gamers. So that's another way also of filtering the correct people for your survey. And then we also have what we call standardized surveys and researcher-made surveys. So standardized surveys are surveys that are already available and have already went an extensive battery of statistical validity tests. So the construct validity, internal consistency, discriminant validity have already been done. No? And usually there are research studies which really does this. And there are already a lot of standardized surveys that are available. So for example, you are measuring quality of life. This is the WHO quality of life scale, no, brief scale, and they already have different facets that they are already measured, and this has already been tested all over the world. So if you want to measure quality of life, this could already be your instrument to be used, no, and when I say in a conceptual framework, components, another term or the usual term that we call them in the field of instrument development, we call them domains. So for example, if the variable is quality of life, so what are the domains of quality of life? So for this instrument, it's global quality of life, overall quality of life, physical health, psychological health, social relationships, and environmental quality of life. No, so that's the reason why I'm always asking in the conceptual framework, what are the components of your variables? Because some of the instruments, they have domains, and those domains are comparable to the components that I am discussing to you earlier. Now, another form of survey, if it's not standardized, is a researcher-made survey. It means that it is the researcher who is going to create their own questionnaire for their variables. So this is usually done if there is no available survey for standardized survey for your variable. Now, which is a better instrument? Is it standardized survey or researcher-made survey? The better one is really standardized survey, because again, the validity of the instrument has already been tested. There's already statistical validity, and there is more where it's more dependable. You know, it's more reliable because you're sure that it's really measuring what it's supposed to measure, compared to a researcher-made survey that is not yet tested for validity. But sometimes, you know, especially in some social science phenomena, some of them, they don't have variables yet. So for you, in your case, so how about me? I have a variable, and I've identified components, and the components that I have do not match a good standardized tool that I've seen for my variable. What do I do? So there are two things. It's either you go on and create your researcher-made survey, but the risk there is that it's not as valid. But it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just that it's not as valid as a standardized questionnaire. Or you can revisit your related literature, look into how the standardized tool has been used, and probably reorganize your conceptual framework and your definition of terms to match the components found or the domains found in the standardized tool. And in that way, first there's a little bit of abala. No? There is a little bit of discomfort because you have to go back to some parts of your papers in order to align your instrument with them. But at least you're sure that you are measuring a more valid way, no, compared to a researcher-made survey. No? But there are some variables that you just have to really make a researcher-made survey because it doesn't need validation. Like for example, when you're asking for gender, male or female, it doesn't need that it doesn't need to be validated. You can make that already. Commonly in our department, we usually go for researcher-made surveys, no, and also standardized surveys. So there's really nothing bad if you do standardized surveys or researcher-made surveys. But on a larger account of things, no, when you look at publishability and applicability and desirability of the scholarly community, especially the social sciences, in a quantitative realm, usually they really go for standardized surveys. But whichever is good for you is okay also with me, as long as whatever survey you do measures the variables that you intended in the first place. So what type of questions do we often see in survey questionnaires or in questionnaires? We have open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions, they're usually asked for less structured, it's more flowing for the respondent to answer. For example, how do you maintain your motivation while training? So the how, the why questions are more open-ended. But for survey, especially for self-administered surveys, this is not something that we want because we want something that's quantifiable or categorical. So we usually go for close-ended questions. For example, gender, there is a question, there is already some options for you to answer, male or female. Or for example, when it's more of a social construct, like for example, training motivation. So I am passionate about attending trainings, and then they just choose 1, strongly agree, 2, disagree, neutral. For 3, 4, agree, 5, strongly agree. This is an example of a Likert scale, and we'll discuss this in a while because Likert scales is kind of a lifeblood of social research. Most of the social phenomenon that is outside categorical variables are usually measured using Likert scales. And if you're doing a researcher-made questionnaire, usually they are Likert scales. So we will discuss them later. So what are types of closed-ended questions? So one, we have the dichotomous question. So obviously these are questions that only has 2 available answers. For example, they believe that death penalty is ever justified. You only have saying yes or no. Now, if you put here maybe or not sure, then that's not anymore a dichotomous question. Please enter your gender, male or female. Again, you can also do a multiple choice question, more than 2 options. So for example, how important is it for you to avoid pregnancy at this time? And then they have options to be able to answer the said question above. And then we also have a cafeteria question, which is a specific multiple choice type questions, which basically asks which of the following views are more representative of you, and then they get to choose only one of those representative answers. No? So for example, this one talks about the views in terms of family planning. And then we also have a rank order questions. For example, in this case, people value different things in life. Below is a list of things that many people value. Please indicate their order of importance to you by placing 1 beside most important, 2 with the next, and then 3, 4, 5. So for example, in this case, for example, for me, I would say health, family relationships, and then money, and then friends, and then career, and then religion. So that is a rank order question. In online, you can actually do this by dragging, and then top with the most priority and, the bottom as the least priority. Next is a forced choice question, which is an example of a dichotomous question, which basically doesn't, again, offer a middle ground. Like, for example, what statement closely represents your point of view? What happens to me is my own doing, or sometimes I don't feel enough control over my life. So control, no in the middle. No, so this is usually used for more psychological variables. And then we have the rating questions, no, wherein we place a line of numbers 0 to 10, and then having verbal interpretations for the least number and the highest number, and then we ask the person to indicate their perception by placing a circle on the number. Okay. We can also have checklist or matrix questions, which again usually will be your strategy for your own surveys, because usually a variable or a domain of your variable is answered by multiple questions, and then each multiple questions will have their own rating scales, and then they identify themselves based on their understanding of the item that you have placed. And then we also have visual analog scale. So visual analog scale is a more psychological way. Instead of putting numbers, you ask the person to draw a line, draw a line intersecting another line that has that measures a certain indicator. For example, as pain as it could be and no pain at all. So for example, you are really experiencing pain, and then you put a line where your pain is found, and then what the psychologist, so the psychometrician, will do is to measure the length of from here to there, and that will be the value that they will put in the record. So, but I don't really advise this for you because one, it's hard to do online, this type of, and number two, it takes some psychometric expertise for you to be able to do this. So usually you would see yourself doing more of a checklist, more of a Likert scale. So speaking of Likert scales, again, one of the lifebloods of social research surveys are Likert scales. Because again, most of our social phenomena are measured by putting observable items or observable indicators to measure more latent variables. For example, it's really hard to observe something so abstract like motivation or mental well-being. So what we do here is that we identify items that could be indicators, observable indicators that the respondent would read and would agree on or disagree on, and then we look into the scores collected from all of the items, and that will be the score that we will place for that specific domain, for that specific variable. So again, Likert scale has been introduced by Rensis Likert in 1932. It's consisting of several declarative statements that express viewpoints. For example, in this case, this is a job satisfaction. And for the question, you would see that these questions are indicators or statements that has something to do with job satisfaction. Right, in many facets of the job satisfaction, and then it is part. So the respondent will answer the extent to which they agree or disagree with certain items, and then the goal of the researcher is to count, or it's either they do an average or a mean for all, or they add. And that becomes the sum, and that becomes the score for job satisfaction. And then the responses usually are in a continuum of 5 or 7 response options. If it's 5, we call it a 5-point Likert scale. If it's 7, then we call it a 7-point Likert scale. And then in other disciplines, they like to have Likert scales that are even numbered, because they want to have it also a forced choice question, so they will also see 4-point Likert scale. So again, it's based, whatever choice there should be justified based on the respondent and the phenomenon that you are measuring. Yun nga, like I said, responses to the items, for example, this one, are summed to compute a total score. Some of them are meaned also. So, what are the steps in developing instruments or surveys for your study? One, you identify your data needs, and it is really important that you make sure that all of your variables will have their own data collection plan and their own instrument. Next, you can develop your own, if you need, a researcher-made questionnaire, or you can adapt. Adapt is in the middle of researcher-made and standardized, meaning you might need to borrow or edit items from a standard questionnaire, or you can completely borrow a standardized questionnaire. Usually the process for borrowing is you have to cite them. You have to cite them when you are using their questionnaires. And then cluster related questions to separate modules. Again, the modules should be based on the variables. So it should be following the domains within the variables, and then the variables based on how they are measured in your conceptual paradigm. And then decide on proper sequencing of the modules. Again, the usual sequencing is based on your conceptual paradigm. And then this is very important. You have to develop an introductory statement with important instructions. Why instructions are very important? So that they are going to answer your questions correctly. And then have instrument reviewed by peers or advisors as experts, so that they know whether or not it works. It is correctly measuring, especially if it's a researcher-made questionnaire. You have to pre-test the instrument. Pre-testing means that you either do a simple statistical test, like for example a Cronbach alpha, to be able to see the consistency, or you just do the pre-test and then ask the people who are engaged in the pre-test to make comments about the construction of the questionnaire, whether it was easily understandable, too many questions, the layout was good, etc., etc. Remember that the participants in your pretest instrument cannot be used for your main respondents in the actual study. So pretesting is very important because it tests the questionnaire so that you don't miss out on the mistakes later. And then, revise the instrument, of course, based on the comments and the pretest results. So, I'll give again an example from the study that I did. What I did was I measured social demographic profile and related it to student involvement and mental health status. And then, the student involvement and mental health status, I also correlated with each other, and then I also correlated these three with quality of life. So I have 4 variables: social demographic profile, student involvement, mental health status, and quality of life. And then each variable has specific components, as you can see here, or domains. Now, the quality of life is only just one domain. Some instruments do not have multiple domains, and that's okay. Okay, for example, for my social demographic profile, these are the domains. Alright? And then there should be good instructions. Alright? Okay. So, for student involvement, if you remember, I have 3 domains: school activities, campus-based organization, interaction with school social entities. So I also have 3: campus activities, campus-based organizations and memberships, and social interactions. This one is an example of a Likert scale. So this one is researcher made. I made this. And I also made the pretest. I also did expert validation for this. So this one. Next, we have mental health status. And as you can see, for mental health status, I have 6 domains. So the 6 domains are here: anxiety, depression, loss of behavioral and emotional control, genitive positive affect, life satisfaction, emotional ties. And there is already items in the 38 item. I couldn't show here because it's quite long. It's 38 items, so I wasn't able to show it here. And then there are those items which we call reverse coded. So what do you mean by reverse coded? You will learn this more in your quanti, but I will already introduce you. So what does this mean? I'll give an example. So for example, the variable is family relationships. Here are 2 example indicators. I feel very close to my family. So when they answer 4, it's a good thing, meaning that they are close to their family. But when you see the second, I feel like a stranger in my own home, this is a negatively stated statement. So when they answer 4 here, it means that it's not a good in terms of family relationship. So instead of 4, the actual score that you will encode is 2. Their answer is 4, but because the actual scoring should have been 4, 3, 2, 1. And mixing positive and negative instrument or indicators in your instrument is a good thing because it will kind of give sort of confirmations, no, within the answering, so that the participant will not just answer yes to all or strongly agree to all. They will really read so that they would know if they're answering a negatively framed question or not. And for the fourth one is on quality of life. So I made use of student quality of life scale. This is just like the mental health. This one is also a standardized questionnaire. It has 10 items, no, and there is one reverse coded. So if you are making your own questionnaire, here are some tips when you word your statements in your question. So 1, should be clear. Clarity. Are the questions worded clearly and unambiguously? Number 2, respondent capability. Can they understand based on their characteristics? No? If you're going to use an English, do they really understand English, or should it be better if you translate it in Tagalog? Are they qualified to provide the information? Next is bias. Are response biases minimized? So you can do this by mixing positive and negatively framed questions or statements into your questionnaire to make sure. And sensitivity. Are questions worded sensitively, especially questions of private nature? Like for example, when you ask about sexual or spiritual well-being, so you have to be very respectful in the way you are wording your questions. Now, in identifying how many and what statements, you have to make sure that you also ask yourselves this as you create your questionnaire. 1, coverage. Do options cover all significant alternatives? Next, overlap. Are response options mutually exclusive, or are you just repeating the statements and you're just changing it into negative, or you're just using synonyms? So it should not be that way, no? You should make sure that while they are measuring the same domain, they should be at least different from each other. Ordering. Are the options ordered rationally? Some questionnaires, they're rumbled, they're scrambled all over, and then it is the researcher who will find the statements within a domain. Some, they already organize it based on domains. Now, some questionnaires find some more success when they ramble the numbers or the statements. Some find more success in domains. Again, there should be some justification based on what you need. Like for example, in this one, no, in the mental health inventory, as you can see, the questions are jumbled. It's not okay. I'll ask anxiety first and remove all, and then put all the questions on anxiety, and then I go to depression. No, all of the 38, they jumbled the order of the questions, and I think the idea for that is for the person who is answering not to gain some sort of mastery of the questions that might, cause bias. And length. Are options too long, or all the options of equal length? So if you say it's like 5-point Likert scale, all has to be 5-point Likert scale in the matrix. So in planning your questions for your variables, if you're going to do a researcher made, you are going to be asked to do this. Okay, first, in the first column are your variables. So I just gave one example of variable here. So for your variable, for example, the variable is physical literacy. Okay, now I want you to go back to your conceptual and operational definition and put them here. And then from your operational definition, you have to put now your domains, no? So your indicators or your domains. So according to the operational definition, Physical literacy will refer to attitudes related to physical fitness and confidence to engage in physical activity. So those are the domains. Attitudes related to physical fitness and confidence to engage in physical activities. Now, you will have to create questions to be able to measure these two indicators that measures physical literacy. No? So this is more of a deductive way of doing this. No? So you indicate what type of questions you're going to use. So you have a 5-point Likert scale for both, with 5 strongly agree, 4 agree, etc., etc. And to measure attitudes, these are the statements that they will agree or disagree on. So for attitudes, I have chosen, I have a positive attitude and interest in sports. I appreciate myself and others doing sports. I can relate to people who are physically fit. Okay, and I am aware of the benefits of sports to health. So that is for the attitudes. As you can see, the questions are more attitudinal and perceptive. This one is more of confidence to engage. So I am physically fit in according to my age. I possess self-management skills for fitness. I possess self-evaluation skills for health. And I am confident to survive in nature. So this is more on confidence to do physical activities. So that is your this is what you will do per variable, for your assignment later. Now, let's talk about quantitative research rigor. When we say rigor, this means the quality, of the research. How valid are the findings? How good is the design? Have we eliminated bias? Now, there are 2 types of validity that we look at when we talk about quantitative research. And the first one is internal validity and the second one is external validity. Internal validity talks about the truth of the findings. How true are the findings that you are able to get in the research? Now, the truth is both in the both based on the design of your study and both based also on extraneous variables, meaning environmental and internal factors of the participants that can affect the way they answer a certain survey. So again, in order for you to ensure internal validity, you have to make sure that the research methods that you're using are accurate, because if they're not, then of course garbage in, garbage out. Wrong research methods, wrong findings. And then it's also important for you to check the validity and reliability of your instrument, because it's simple, no? If you use a blood pressure cuff to measure breathing, you won't get the correct measure for breathing. Or if you make use of a uncalibrated stopwatch to measure speed, you won't be able to measure speed correctly. So if you turn the stopwatch into a questionnaire, you have to make sure that the questionnaire is really measuring what you intend to measure. Number 2, it should be able to elicit some form of honesty from your respondents. Now, for example, you're asking them about hygienic practices, and if the way you construct your questionnaire is insensitive, they might be defensive about about their answers, and this could cause dishonesty from the participants or from the respondents. So it's really important for you to make the best questionnaire so that you are collecting the correct data, because again, garbage in, garbage out. Wrong data, wrong results. Now, how do you make sure that the data is not incorrectly collected? Then you make sure that you make the best instrument that you can possibly make. And then, of course, there should be a way for you to control extraneous variables. Extraneous variables can be environmental or social contexts that you can or cannot control, that can affect the measurement of your independent or your dependent variable. Like for example, when you're measuring pain, there are certain people inherently who have higher pain thresholds compared to those who have lower pain threshold. So there are those people, who just get a paper cut and they would say, no, it is the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. And you'd see some people have broken their bones but say, no, I can do this. It's not very painful for me. So that's an example of an extraneous variable for the variable of pain. For example, you have a variable on confidence, and there are those people who are coming from cultures who identify themselves as very confident, then that the cultural context might affect that as well. There are times that you can control them. Like for example, you are going to just limit your collection of participants to a specific culture so that culture will not be an extraneous variable, and I will explain that more. Some of them you cannot control, like for example, pain threshold, or for example, you're talking about the relationship between, for example, bullying and depressive episodes. Now, what if the person already has a diagnosis of depression? So how can you be sure that the data that you're collecting is really related to bullying, or is it really because the person is already diagnosed? So that's another example of extraneous variable. So you have to understand all of these things. So some of these things you can control, some of the things you cannot control, because there are some things that the researcher can't control. Like for example, gender of the person, you cannot control that. Or for example, the person's parents, you cannot if you're talking about the effect of bullying, and you're measuring your interest is just bullying and depression, and then they measure high in depression, but it's not really because of the bullying, but it's because of their parents or their family structure, which is outside of bullying. So again, these are can control. And when you cannot control extraneous variables, they have to be admitted in the methodological limitation centers. Methodological limitation section. So it's important. So, in writing research, honesty is a big thing. The researcher is not a god, and it's not perfect. They will be encountering a lot of extraneous variables that they cannot control. And what they do here is that they give a full disclosure. You know what? This is what we measured, but we know based on the related literature and based on common sense that there are many things that we weren't able to control, and these things that we weren't able to control. So it's up to you, the reader, whether you accept the truthfulness of our findings or not. But again, it's not that you just if you can control, then go. You should control those extraneous variables. Other forms of validity outside internal and external are statistical conclusion validity, meaning are you using the correct statistics, which is again something that you will learn later when you get to your deeper statistics and quantitative research class. And of construct validity, I have already explained this to you before, but is the instrument really able to measure the constructs or the concepts of your study? The second one that's very important also for quantitative research is the external validity, or the extent to which you can generalize the findings. So, are you able to translate the results at large? Meaning, did you collect enough samples in order for you to say that, yes, this sample represents the rest of the population, so the findings that I get here can be represented for the whole of the university. Okay? The randomness of the collection also increases its representativeness, the generalizability and representativeness of the sample. Is there a proportionate number of men and women in the study, a proportionate number of people in regions to be able to really say that there's a generalizability of the findings, and this is something that is being approached by or pursued by, let's say, big like social weather stations or Pulse Asia. When they collect, they only collect data from 10,000 people, but because there's randomness, adequacy, and representativeness in terms of creating the sample, they are able to to generalize the findings of the whole of the Filipino population. And so it's important that when you are not able to have adequate number of samples because of certain physical limitations or feasibility limitations, you cannot do randomness because again limitations, and representativeness, it's important to contextualize the findings. For example, you're only able to get it from your university. You cannot say that the findings represent the whole of the college population in NCR or in the Philippines, because you were only able to collect it in school A. So you can only contextualize the usability or utilizability of your findings to school A. So what are the ways that we can control intrinsic subject characteristics that are extraneous variables? So the best way really is randomization and representativeness, because the goal is when you collect a large enough random sample, the values of the extraneous variables will cancel each other out. So that's the goal of randomization. Also, doing representativeness or making sure that groups are equally and proportionately represented while also randomizing, again, also introduces some form of canceling out, kasi because may randomization nga. Another way to do it is homogeneity. So for example, I feel like you as a researcher, you say, I feel like the research that I will do in if the person that I interview or I get data from is from Luzon, it would be different. If it's from Visayas, it would be different from Mindanao. So what I would do is that I would just get people from Luzon, so that at least culturally they have a more common cultural context, so the cultural context will not be an extraneous variable. The con in doing homogeneity of just, for example, collecting in one area or collecting in a few in a specific set of people is that its generalizability is dampened, it cannot be applied to everyone, because again, you're just limited to a single university, or a single set of people. So the people who can relate to the findings is only those whose characteristics are the same with the people you collected data from. Another best way of controlling intrinsic characteristic that can be extraneous variables is statistical control of possible confounders. So this means that you are going to choose higher level of statistics and putting into the equation confounders. Like, for example, if you feel like gender is going to be a confounder, then you put that into the equation and let math do its part to control it, so even if you didn't do randomization, if you're going to do statistical control, then it will still solve the extraneous variable issue. The problem here, the con here, is that you have to be able to know this high level of statistics to be able to really control the confounders. Now, these are the parts of the chapter 2, and the title of chapter 2 is methodology. I won't really be asking you to write the full length of a chapter 2 for our class, because this is more for your advanced quantitative class, but I want you to start already drafting this for our class. So, what are the different parts? First, the research design. So we discussed this earlier, the discussion of the blueprint of how the study will go based on a specific design. And then the next one is research local. This basically tells us where you're going to the study, and of course justifying why you're choosing this as a local for your study. The third one is the research instrument. So the research instrument is the description of the instruments that you're going to use in the study. So very important here is that you say that for this variable, this is the instrument that I use. For this variable, this is the instrument that I use. So you already tell them about the instruments that you will use per variable. But remember, this is just a description. The actual research instrument is found in the appendix. So the actual questionnaire is in the appendix. In the research instrument section is only just a description of the instrument. Now, sometimes in BSD, we require the table that I showed you earlier, this one. They also require this in the instrument section, so that in just one looking, we already see the variables and the indicators and the questions. Probably not this detailed, but a table could help in further describing the instrument. And then population and sampling, which basically tells us about the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, the sample size, the target population, and the sampling technique to be used. For data gathering procedure, this basically tells the reader about the step-by-step process to be undertaken by the researcher in order to do the study. So usually we start with administrative clearance, meaning who are you going to ask for permission from, and then after that is recruitment. How are you going to invite the participants? And then next is administration of questionnaires. By the way, and then after that, after the administration of questionnaires is the collation of the data. So this is usually the process when you're explaining, when you're doing the what do you call this? When you're doing the survey, a survey study, this is your data gathering procedure. Also, in the description of instruments or in the data gathering procedure can also talk about the pre-testing process that you used. All right? And then we have data analysis procedure where you put all of the statistical tools that you will use based on the variables that you're going to be measuring. So you're going to be using mean, median, mode, standard deviation, Kruskal-Wallis, etc. So this one you will learn for your more advanced statistics class. And then you also have ethical consideration and explanation of all of the ethics consideration based on the principles we discussed in our third lecture and how you are going to address them in your study. And then also we have the last methodological limitations. What were the limitations in your study in terms of sample size, in terms of design, in terms of interpretation, and then of course the extraneous variables that you were not able to control. You also have to disclose them here in the methodological limitations and section as I explained earlier. And then the proposal does not end with chapter 2. You have to have your reference section. So this is after chapter 2. So reference follow 7th edition of APA, and then after that your appendix. Usually your appendix for your proposal has your actual questionnaire or survey forms. So in this video lecture, you were able to learn about how to collect data, learn about the nature of the variables, how to develop instruments based on the variables and the data needs of your study. And we also discussed about what makes a quantitative research good, what makes it rigorous.